Here we are at the State of OpenCon, here with Emily Omier, and we are here in the Matt Cave. Now, Emily has her own cave next door. You can kind of see it in the background, maybe.
Mine is more of a cave because there's no lights for some reason.
Yeah, it is a little weird. I have a lot of lights behind me, and Emily has no lights. So, go figure. Yes.
So we were going to talk, about the conference and in general about conference strategy.
Yes.
Which I think is really interesting because I've had some really good conversations with people. We also, this is our second conference that we've been to together. We were both at FOSDEM last weekend. And one of the really interesting conversations I had with actually some former clients of mine at FOSDEM was about conferences that we go to. And we were talking about like, how do they choose what conferences they go to? And one of the founders was mentioning like, we try to evaluate like what the value is. Are we going to get value out of this conference? And then he was like, but we would go to FOSDEM even if we didn't get any value out of it.
Yeah. I think that's what's so funny is there are conferences that people just love, and they're going to go no matter what. And then there are conferences that are the outcome's business, right? And so those are two diametrically opposed things. I actually probably think there's three, right? So you have learning. I have to go because I don't know something, right? Mm-hmm. And so people who are going to learn, people who are going because it's their vibe, it's their tribe, it's their community, it's where they want to go hang out. Or I think you also have people who are going for a business outcome.
Yeah, I was thinking this exactly the same thing. And that you sort of have to figure out like what's our conference goal? Is it that we're going to a conference to learn, or is it that we're going to a conference because we expect to sell stuff to or meet with our customers? And those, especially if you're an open source company, like those can be very different. Like possibly as an open source company, coming to something like State of OpenCon, this might not be where your customers are. It might be the kind of place where you go to learn. And that's okay. You just have to be sort of self-aware about what is this the kind of place where your customers are hanging out or no? Because like, honestly, State of OpenCon could also be where your customers are. It just depends. You have to be self-aware about who those customers are going to be.
But even if the customers come to a place, doesn't mean they are the right people at the customer, or that they're even wanting to be sold to or talked to about commercial stuff, right? FOSDEM's a really great example of this. FOSDEM attracts many, many companies. In fact, many of the companies and people that I've talked to here at this conference were at FOSDEM last week. And going to FOSDEM in the past, when I've done a booth there, or a table, you're not going to sell to anyone at FOSDEM. They don't want to talk commercials. They don't want to talk, anything that's business related. If you talk about your enterprise versions, they're just like, nope. And so I think that's a big difference.
And that's like knowing the vibe of the conference. And also it's almost like, you think about the booth at FOSDEM is like your top of funnel awareness, and your booth at some other conference where you have a lot of buyers, like with checkbooks in their pocket, so to speak, is your bottom of the funnel.
Yeah.
And you have to know like, well, what's your priority, first of all, and, know the audience of the conference so you know what you're going to do. And, if you're an open source company, you could go to, one and just only talk about your open source stuff, and the other and only talk about your enterprise stuff, because that's what matters.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people make the mistake that they go to a conference with the exact same message when they have a booth, no matter the conference, right? The best Kubernetes thing in the world, or whatever, right? They go with that specific thing in mind over and over again. And it doesn't resonate, right? Like you go in there and you look and you're like, why are they here? I don't understand. And so while I know you deal a lot with the product positioning and messaging, event positioning and messaging is just as critical, especially if you're looking to get like a high ROI out of an event.
Yes. Yeah, I have actually had, I have gotten clients because they were preparing for an event and they were like, we realized we had no idea what to put on our booth. And that's why we reached out to you. And that they didn't know how to position themselves for the event, but more fundamentally, they didn't know how to position their company. And that, when I talk to companies about positioning, right, especially if you're open source, you have all these components, right? You have your project positioning, you have your product positioning, and then you have your overarching company positioning. And knowing which one is appropriate for that conference is really important. Like our example, right? You go to FOSDEM and you're like, you want to lean in heavy on your project, and maybe you just don't want to talk about the other stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's totally true.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes you just need those catchy taglines or something too. Like we went to a Microsoft conference and our tagline, which just drove people to our booth, was "Don't run your databases with bubble gum and duct tape," and we gave away bubble gum and duct tape, right? And it was funny because everyone would stop by, take a picture, and be like, "Oh my God, my databases are run like that," right? And so if you could find that way to connect with the audience and understand who's there, that really, really helps. Now, when we're choosing, and here's the thing, as someone in the open source space, there are certain things that I look for, but how do you evaluate which conferences you come to?
All right, so I'm a consultant.
Yes.
And so I am just like any other business person, I suppose. I think about, is this a conference that I'm going to learn at? Is this a conference that I'm going to meet potential clients at? And there is also, of course, an element of like, is this conference going to be fun? I will say, like, when I think about what conferences do for my business, I think like very long tail. I go to conferences to build relationships. I don't go to conferences to close deals. And I think that attitude scales to like however large your company is, even if you have a giant company as opposed to my like company of one. So anyway, I also think like in-person interactions with people are really valuable. Again, like I go to conferences to build connections. So yeah, I work with open source startups, so I would choose conferences where I think things related to open source are going to be there.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's about it.
So, that's interesting, like you're going for the relationships. And that's a good thing because you go in with the idea that, a successful conference might be meeting 10 potential new people who you didn't know before, right? Or having so many conversations. I'm a nerd. I have a spreadsheet for this. I do. I have a spreadsheet for this. And what I'll do as I go into a conference is I'll look at things like that and I'll say like, okay, did I get a talk? I got a talk. How many people attended the talk? And if I was able to get a keynote, how many people like were at the conference in total? How many people did I potentially bring awareness to me or to my company? And then I'll look at other things like how many LinkedIn people did I add, or Mastodon or Twitter or whatever, right? And it sounds weird, but it actually, like it comes out with a Matt's magic formula, like number at the bottom, and then I'm like, that was worth the money or it wasn't. Mm-hmm. And then the next time I go through, then I can go like, okay, I'm gonna just kick that away. Like I'm not doing that one again. And there's several conferences that I've gone to where I'm like, yeah, it just wasn't cost justifiable. Mm-hmm. Or it might be justifiable to test it, but it's not justifiable to maybe go in the same capacity, right? Let's be honest, conferences are expensive, right? Attending is one thing, and attending can be expensive. Here we are in London. I mean, you flew from Portland. I flew from Raleigh. And I thought this was a great conference. I met a lot of people. So from a flight perspective, it was worth it. I have no idea about sponsorships, right? So you would have to go to each individual booth and see, like, did you get the traffic? Was this what you expected? If I had a booth here, I could tell you that, but I don't. In the past, there's some conferences that I've gone to, and it's like, oh man, this is a great vibe, but there's just no way I'm getting a booth. There's no way I'm paying it. There was one conference, I don't even remember what it was. They just did their CFP, and relatively new conference, and it's like minimum buy-in's like $50K for a booth, and it's like just a small like table kiosk thing, and that's like, wow. You know how much you have to get to make that back?
Yeah, and especially if you have a company, unlike me, where it's just me. Although I do have to pay for my daughter to come with me because she's my sidekick, so I pay double airfare.
It's an experience for her. It's an investment in her future.
Exactly. But yeah, so if you have a company and you're manning a booth, and now you got like 4 or 5 people that are also flying over here, they're also staying in a hotel. Oh yeah, and by the way, they're also not doing whatever it is that their like usual job is. That's a huge investment.
Yeah.
And I think, when you're thinking about your conference strategy, whether like a conference could be worth it for you as a founder or for like a representative from your company to go to individually, and not be worth it to sponsor. And you have to think about, like, is your average attendee going to be your buyer or your user? Versus, like, is it just that a bunch of really important contacts are going to be there and you're going to like have back-to-back meetings? Because if that's the case, just go, but don't sponsor. But if people are going to be walking by and they're in your target market, then that's a situation where you might want to sponsor.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that it is something that you are going to need to look closely at, what the outcomes, who's going to be there, what sort of things can you do. There's also a lot of different activities that you can do. There's a whole smorgasbord. I think I can use smorgasbord. I think most people will know what that is. A buffet. It's a big buffet of different options you could do when you go to these conferences. And sponsoring is just one of them. People do dinners, right?
Yeah,
and
happy
like,
hours.
Happy hours, or, maybe they'll do, like, come meet me at the Starbucks across the street, or maybe put on a meetup. So there's all kinds of different ways and different strategies, but a lot of it does depend on what your outcomes are. And I think that, thinking about those before you commit to any conference is important, and putting some expectations on it, because a lot of times you're taking a chance at the first time you go to a conference. You need to evaluate whether you want to go to the second or the third conference. That's the most critical thing, right? So maybe you've got, some desire to test out, the fancy new open source conference, State of OpenCon, this year. And that's cool. You should try it, and you should see if it works for you, if it fits. And as that conference grows, if you grow with it, that's awesome. But if it's not your demographic, that's okay too. And sometimes you just need to try it once or twice, or at least just attend and see if it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a really smart strategy to just attend, and particularly like before you sponsor, like really like throw down the big bucks.
Yeah, and you could still invite people to dinner. Put up a LinkedIn, and let's do a meetup. Let's get together. Everybody who is interested in software X, we're going to go to a bar across the street, and I'm going to buy the first round of drinks.
Yeah. Yeah. I went to a happy hour after FOSDEM that was just, run by a particular company. It was probably the best time that I had. I mean, is that true? I don't know. I enjoyed giving my talk, but it was really, really valuable. And I think it was pretty valuable for them, for the people who put it on, because they also got to make a whole number of connections. And I mean, like I said, that's why I go to conferences, make connections in person. So something like a happy hour is really good for that. With like limited number of invitees, it's not like the conference happy hour where it's like everyone is there.
Now, okay. The next part of this, though, is a little different, because there's also the opportunity to go as a speaker. And where to submit and how to get selected, that's a whole deeper topic.
Yeah, so I am not an expert at this. I think you are probably more of an expert, because like I'm not batting 1,000 on my CFPs.
No one does. No one does. Do not feel bad. No one bats 1,000. I think like I might submit 100 and get like 2 accepted.
Oh, okay. Phew, I think
just
I'm doing
submit
better
more
than that.
you.
Okay,
I just
you
submit
probably,
more than you.
So, okay. However, particularly like what I would say if I was advising somebody else, like you want to make sure that you're submitting CFPs to places where your target audience is, or your target market is going to be in the audience. And then you want to make sure you're talking about subjects that you want to be known for. And okay, with the caveat that like particularly if you're not very comfortable with public speaking, there is some value in just like taking every opportunity you can get. That is, it's not this like there really is some value in just like, you know, if you have an opportunity to talk about something that's even tangentially related to your expertise and to your company, if you don't have much experience with it, like maybe you should take that. But this is actually one of the areas where I think positioning is really important because one of the things that I like to work with clients on is like distilling down their point of view. And that is actually pretty attractive to conference organizers to get a talk that that is opinionated about something. And when I say like opinionated, it could be a lot. There's a lot of different types of opinions. It could be a technical opinion. It could be an ethical opinion. And you want to, when you go to a conference, you want to hear things that are fresh. Mm-hmm. And conference organizers want content that's fresh. They want talks that are fresh. And if you have a take on something that's relevant to your company that is not what everyone else is saying, that's what you want to be talking about, because it's more likely to be accepted. It's also more likely to be memorable for people. And, you know, you want it to be relevant. Like if you have a technical opinion about something, submit a talk related to that, and then like make sure it is tied into something about your product or your project. Because then it's going to be obvious. Well, also then it's going to sort of self-select people. People that come to your talk are going to be like primed to love your project or your product.
Yeah. Well, and I think that that's a really good point, right? You want to take an opinion. You don't want to just walk the middle. I think that, you know, people are, you know, passionate about the stuff that they're going to see, the tools that they use, the software that they use. So having your passion show through and having your ability to, you know, kind of convey, you know, that, you know, this is what I think is best, or this is where I think this is going. People are interested in that. There's a fine line with your product that you have to make sure you don't cross, and that's trying to sell it too much. That's one thing that will get you shut down pretty quick.
Yes, I didn't talk about that. When you do a point of view talk, you're talking about your point of view. You're not talking about your product. The only product placement is like at the very end when you have that slide that's like, my name is blah, 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 and I work at blah, blah, blah. That's it. Your talk, like you should not ever mention your company, unless you're like doing a talk about your project. That sometimes flies in open source. But yeah, in general, it's like totally product agnostic. But if you have that point of view, it should be obvious. Like if you agree with this, I mean, for somebody who like does their homework afterwards and is like, oh yeah, you know, I really agree with that person's point of view. Let me go look them up. Oh yeah, look at this product. Oh yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I think that's a whole nother topic that we could cover at a different time, which is the soft sell. Mm-hmm. And how in the open source space, the soft sell is much better than any hard sell. Yeah. And that's something that I think most people don't get. And it's the same at the conference talks. People are there to learn. They're there to expand their minds, their points of view. They're not there to be sold to in most cases. And I can tell you that I've been to a number of conferences where you'll see basic product pitches that no one attends, or if they are attending, they're using the space as a place to work while they're kind of listening to you in the background. And unless you're thinking that your product's going to get sold through osmosis, which I don't think it necessarily will, I think you're going to have a hard time at those conferences. And most of those are paid for. Because when you spend big bucks, like, you know, you go to some of these conferences, you spend $100,000, $1 million, they'll give you all kinds of talks for free. And that's when all of a sudden, like, they start plugging in those sales pitches, mm-hmm. right? And It's weird. I've been to conferences that have 30,000 people, and you'll go, into a room that's kind of a sales pitch, and there'll be like two, and it's like, they would rather not do that, right? They don't want to go. They don't want to get sold to. So I think that's really important and critical. My advice for people who are looking to submit something to a conference, a couple things. I think number one, pick things that you're already passionate about, right? But don't get discouraged if you're not accepted. Go to the organizers later on and, ask them, like, okay, what could I do better? I really want to talk next year. What are the things that I could do to get on here? What are you interested in? When you do attend, look at the other speakers. What have they talked about, right? And see what they're doing and read their CFPs. Read their descriptions and see what they do that maybe you didn't. Also, I think don't pick just the boring titles. Titles matter so much, right? I gave a talk here, the Supervillain's Guide to Destroying an Open Source Community. Well, you can rewrite that as, how should you build your open source community? Well, there's going to be a dozen talks on that are potentially submitted. So how do I stand out? Mm-hmm. You're standing out. So, supervillain, I'm going to destroy your community, right? And so, boom, there you go. You're innovative, you're fun, and you're giving the exact same talk you want. It's just a little different.
I think that's especially true in the open source area. People really like the sort of edgy, interesting, funny titles.
Absolutely. Right. I get I've submitted talks and it's the exact same talk, right? The death of open source, how big money's ruining open source forever. And then I've submitted titles, same talk, the business of open source, or open source, the state of open source, 2023 or whatever. And it's like,
so about submitting things, I actually have another tip, which is that I really like to organize panels. In fact, Matt has been on a panel that I organized.
I did. I was.
So here's why I like organizing panels. One, I already mentioned my conference goal is to build relationships. So when you organize a panel, you get to build relationships with whoever is on the panel with you. You get to have wider perspectives on whatever topic it is that you're talking about. I also really like being a connector, so helping other people meet each other, and that's something that you do when you organize a panel. You sometimes everyone already knows each other, but often not, and by definition, they're people who have some shared interests. And then lastly, if you're at all fearful of public speaking, being on a panel is much easier than being doing a talk. There's no prep, or there's minimal prep. And so it's less stressful. The actual delivery is less stressful. So anyway, just a plug there for organizing panels.
All right. Well, so if you're interested in learning more about Emily, you can go to EmilyOmier.com, which is my website. You can also check out The Business of Open Source, which is my podcast. And you can look me up on LinkedIn, where I am Emily Omier. I believe the only Emily Omier. Yeah, I think you might be. And for us, you can find me on the Hacking Open Source Business podcast, or you can check out opensourcemetrics.org for the business guide to run your open source company. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks.